17,000 square foot warehouse filled with coral, I had a blackwater aquarium in my office, and of course, it was bizarre because people would come in and they'd see all these corals, and they'd see me with a freshwater aquarium, and the first thing people would tell me is, it's so dirty, you need to change the water. I'm like, no, that's the whole idea. So what I got into is I always played with twigs and leaves and all kinds of materials in my aquariums as a kid growing up. And I told myself that one day, maybe I'll do more with this, and I just enjoyed it. It just spoke to me. And so what I did is I looked to nature. I spent a lot of time, like many of you, I was fortunate enough to get to travel to some interesting locations around the world and see some of these habitats firsthand. And I realized that a lot of these habitats have one thing in common. They are powered by terrestrial materials in an aquatic environment. When you think about it, obviously, aquatic environments don't exist in a vacuum. They're dependent upon the land. And what comes from the land, trees, and their associated materials, and roots and so forth. And when you see the interaction between the two, it makes a lot of sense. So about 2015, I decided to share my geeky affliction and start a company. I sold my interest in my coral company, which everybody thought I was nuts. Like, why would you get out of that? To start this company I called Tannin Aquatics, and I chose the name Tannin because tannin is the thing that gives water that kind of a look. And I started selling, instead of selling corals, I was selling leaves and twigs and seed pods, which again, people thought was crazy, but it's something that I've gotten into. And now we've got this kind of little worldwide movement of people playing with botanical materials. So the first question is, we say botanical method. What is a botanical method aquarium? Well, it's basically just a way of creating an ecology, aquatic ecology, based on seed pods, leaves, and other materials, and utilizing that in an aquarium to create basically an environment that not only is good for the fish, but good for bacteria, fungal growths, biofilms, materials like that. So part of the challenge in a botanical style or botanical method aquarium, as we call it, is to make a mental shift to understand that some of the things we've been afraid of for so long, like detritus and biofilms and fungal growth, are actually what you want. That's actually what you see in nature, and you see it in the aquariums. So again, to me, an interesting aquarium is one that's a little hard to see here, filled with leaves and twigs and decomposing material, because it's very much like the aquatic habitats that we're used to. And of course, fishes in these types of aquariums will utilize this material not only for shelter and for physical foraging, but for food, supplemental food. And it's not just, they're not eating the leaves and so forth, they're eating the organisms which grow on the leaves. And you can do all kinds of interesting aesthetics with these types of aquariums. That's one of the fun things about them, is that aesthetically they're very different, and functionally they're very different. This sort of marriage of function and aesthetics. We'll talk about that later. But it all starts with leaves. And the reason I say that is because when you've been to many of these aquatic habitats, and I know some of you have traveled, the common denominator with a lot of interesting aquatic habitats around the world is that they have leaves which fall from the trees, because a lot of these locales where fishes are found are in rainforests and meadows and places where trees are and where the leaves will accumulate. Now, leaves form essentially the basis of an ecosystem, and they do that in nature, and they can do the same thing in the aquarium. Now, people have been playing with leaves for a long time. I know a lot of you use leaves to maybe to acidify your water or to color the water. How many people actually have used leaves in aquariums before? Yeah, quite a few people. This is nothing earth-shattering here. The difference with what I'm trying to do with this type of aquarium is actually foster an ecosystem. So it's beyond just getting an aesthetic, just a tint to the water. It's about creating an environment where organisms like fungi and biofilms will grow. So how do leaves benefit our aquariums? Well, they benefit our aquariums not only by imparting tannins, which we all know. Now, tannins are humic substances you're probably aware of. I don't have to rehash this for most of you. There are actually documented known benefits for fishes. There have been studies done, particularly in, there was a study I found in Singapore where some researchers used extract from catappa leaves, which many of you are familiar with, and they used it to inhibit fungal illnesses in fishes. And they got a better hatch rate with tilapia in the study where they used the catappa extract as opposed to just, hatching the eggs in pure fresh water. So there's actually, I don't want to say medicinal, but there are some benefits to it. That's my fan club right there. I really Don't worry, another bottle of formula coming up. The most important thing for me is that leaves recruit biofilms and fungal growths. Now, biofilms and fungal growths are something that most people just freak out about, right? We don't want to see all this gooey stuff. Has anybody ever used leaves, or let me ask you this, how many of you have cured a piece of wood for aquarium use? Like everybody, right? What's that stuff that grows on the wood that you scrape off? Fungus, and everybody says, ew, fungus. Okay, well, interesting thing about fungi, though, is they're some of the most predominant organisms in the aquatic ecosystem. And not only are they interesting organisms in and of themselves, they're called aquatic hyphomycetes, and very interesting organisms which multiply in dead leaves and submerged materials. They also can process nutrients from the water. So you've got an organism that is essentially harmless. It's free for the asking, if you want it, that is, and it's actually removing nitrogenous waste from the water. And what's more interesting is a lot of fishes, if you read some of the scientific papers of fish descriptions, a lot of gut content analysis of a lot of species of fish is things like fungal growths and detritus, which we'll talk about later. So there's a real benefit to having this stuff actually accumulate in your aquarium. And of course, again, I can't get out the part that they create a cool aesthetic in the aquarium. They look different. These things are fundamentally different than just about any other type of aquarium that we keep, because we want all this stuff, this tinted water, this slight patina on everything, the fungal growth on the wood. That's not something to be afraid of or to be polished out. It's something to celebrate. So it's a little different than what a lot of people are used to. Now let's talk about various botanical materials, because that's what everybody asks me about. So what are some of the things we use? We use seed pods. The beautiful thing about nature is there are tons and tons of different seed pods from trees and shrubs that you can use in the aquarium. You don't have to buy them from a company like mine. You can collect things. There's all sorts of material. Most of it is harmless, unless you're dealing with a plant that has a known, I guess the rule of thumb that I would use, if it's something that's known to be toxic to like dogs or cats, I probably wouldn't play with it in an aquarium. But you have to experiment. I'm not a botanist, so I couldn't tell you every single plant that's safe, for fishes. But I can tell you that most of these materials just are, made of lignin and other materials, so they're not particularly harmful to fishes. And what they'll do in the water is they'll do what they do in an aquarium, they'll do what they do in nature, which is to recruit these biofilms and fungal growths. They will impart some tannins and maybe some humic substances and lignins to the water. But essentially, they're really interesting to keep in your aquarium. Then, of course, we use bark. There's all kinds of bark. The catawba tree, or Indian almond tree, which is where we get the catawba leaves from that everybody's familiar with, the bark of that tree happens to be very interesting. It actually has a lot of tannins in there, a lot of interesting compounds like flavonoids and things, which are thought, again, to be beneficial to fishes. They're found in catawba bark as well. So bark is another thing that we use in it, and let's be honest, it looks interesting too when you use it in a tank. And then there's stems, like in this case, this is a Caryota mitis. This is a palm. Now, it's also known as the fishtail palm. I'm not exactly certain why it's called that, but the stems are very interesting. They last a very long time underwater. And that's just another example of a stem that's something that we can use. And then there's twigs. Twigs are my favorite thing in the world. And if you ask me, as a guy who sells botanical materials for a living, what is our top selling material? Twigs. Stuff you can move lawn trash, that's what my friend calls it. So I've got the ultimate job. I've actually created a way to sell lawn trash. But you can literally pick this stuff up anywhere. I use oak. You have a lot of oak. I know there's cypress. There's lots of interesting wood out there. You don't have to cure it or anything. You can boil it or steep it in boiling water. But it's perfectly usable, and I've never had any issues with it. But oak is particularly nice. And as Melanie was showing me the local area, most people look at the trees and say, "Oh, pretty." I look at the trees and go, "Oh, I can use that in my tank." So that's a fish gate for you. So twigs are great, and you can use them along with other aquatic woods to really nice effect. So let's talk about that idea of functional aesthetics. I love coming up with names for everything. To a lot of people, it's just maybe it sounds like marketing hyperbole, but it's nice to have terminology for some things. The idea is that you're taking materials which not only have an interesting look and contribute to the aesthetic of your tank, but they're functional in that they recruit the biofilms, the fungal growths, provide grazing for fishes and shelter. So we call it functional aesthetics. It's a nice way of sort of simplifying what they do. And of course, functional aesthetics can be utilized in all sorts of aquariums, not just black water. People think black water because the water gets tinted from these humic substances and tannins in the water. But you can also use it in this case, it's a brackish aquarium where mangroves and leaves that fall off the mangroves. I don't know, has anybody been to a mangrove habitat? And you see there's tons of leaves. They're anything but a crystal clear, beautiful place. And I was at one just a few weeks ago in the Maldives, and I spent a lot of time digging around the leaves until one day one of the guys from the resort that we were staying at, he came up to me and he said, "Boy, you're really brave." I said, "Why?" He said, "There's alligators all over the place." I'm stupid geek boy with his net and his hydrometer, doing readings on the water, so it's kind of crazy. So yeah, the idea of utilizing all these materials is nothing new, but it's very exciting. Now, this is something that I also, when you talk about functional aesthetics, there's an aquarium that only a fish geek like me could love. This is everything that you were told not to do. Oh, do I have to give you another bottle again? Come on. All right. So what we do in tanks like this is, again, we're talking about, probably not the best shot, but you see fungal growth on this wood. These are terrestrial, obviously, materials, leaves, roots, and so forth. And we encourage the fungal growth and the biofilm. And guess what? These tanks could be running for years. The longest I've had a botanical influence aquarium I've been running for. I had one tank going for 7 years. The only reason I broke it down is because I was sold the house that I was located in and I had to move it. But you can keep these running indefinitely. They're not a transitory type of a tank. This is an example of one that was set up. This was actually a friend of mine, he set it up for a contest, an aquascaping contest. And this is probably the first botanical aquarium I've ever seen in an aquascaping contest. And in addition to, I think, freaking out the judges, he managed to get, I think, second place in the AGA biotope division. And the only reason he got second place is, I think, because the judges just didn't know what to make of this tank. But this is probably one of the most realistic aquariums I've ever seen. His idea was to represent one of my favorite habitats called an agapo, which is a flooded forest. We're going to talk about those in a little bit. That's the thing that gets me really excited. It's a South American flooded forest, and an agapo is the ultimate expression of land and water sort of working together. Again, this is another aquarium, same scenario. Land and water working together. Keep thinking about terrestrial and aquatic materials doing their thing. So the other thing with botanicals that are interesting is fishes interact with them in different ways. I noticed this when I was looking at Melanie's tanks today, how calm some of the fishes are that are normally shy and skittish, because they're set up in an environment which mimics what they've evolved to live in over eons. And we were talking about this on the way over here. She was looking at researching a particular fish, and it said, in the literature, it said they come from leaf litter and twigs and so forth. And then the aquarium suggestion was to set it up with plants. There's no mention of aquatic plants in this environment, but the fish comes from an area of leaf litter, twigs, and so forth. That's what it's comfortable with. And that's an example of, as aquarists, we tend to, we tend to compensate by making things familiar to us. And we're so used to planted aquariums that we don't really think about, hey, this is what they actually live in the wild. So it's something to think about. And of course, botanicals provide a grazing substrate for fishes. They can chew on these biofilms and these fungal growths and the organisms that live among them. So there's a lot of benefits to running one of these types of an aquarium. And of course, shrimp. Love these shrimp. Probably the people that are most familiar with biofilms are those of you that, how many people keep shrimp of various types? And you want the biofilms, right? That's like, you hear that word everywhere. It's a little bacterial biofilms. Now, to most people, biofilm seems like a disgusting thing, but it's actually a very beautiful, elegant, nutritious food source. So let's talk about that mental shift. This is what I always like to say, is that I think we have to sometimes get our heads away from the crystal clear, pure aquariums that are so popular right now in terms of, you go online and you see those the contests, and every aquarium is symmetrical, perfect, crystal clear, vibrant water. The plants are arranged in a perfect, perfect geometric pattern. I mean, who has ever seen that in the wild? You don't. The wild is a random place. This is the Pantanal in Brazil, and this is a flooded meadow. Basically, these are terrestrial grasses growing over a sort of a matrix of leaves and twigs and so forth. And there's a lot of characins that live in these types of habitats. And those of you that just even go out locally, you'll see this type of thing too. It's a phenomenon until very recently, it seems like nobody was really trying to model in an aquarium, because I think we got it in our head that somehow this isn't a sustainable, manageable, replicable thing, when the reality is it's actually quite easy to do and quite stable. Again, there's another aquarium, just a different view. This is a representation of an agapo, a flooded forest in South America, with a substrate consisting of sediments and clays, decomposing leaf litter, and roots. And it not only looks different, but it functions different. Again, the other key takeaway, and those of you that have been to more aquatic habitats than I have can tell you that natural aquatic habitats are anything but the sterile environment that we've convinced ourselves they are. And I think that's the one frustrating thing for me as an aquarist is the way the word nature is sort of bandied about, especially in social media. We love to use the word nature or natural while having an aquarium that's completely dependent on our filtration and our siphon hose and diligent maintenance, when the reality is you can apply all the things that we've learned in a more natural way. And these are not maintenance-free aquariums. Like any aquarium, you want to do water exchanges, use a filter, but there's nothing complicated about maintaining them. The complicated part is getting your head around the idea that these are actually sustainable aquatic systems that you can replicate. Another shot, I'm going to show you a lot of shots of flooded forest in Agapo because they're so interesting to me. The key components, again, here are things like leaf litter, twigs, branches, bark, and you'll notice the water is anything but crystal clear. It's slightly turbid because you have soil. And these are vibrant, really, really diverse ecological systems, and it's not something that we generally replicate in a literal form in our aquariums. And my one hope for a lot of you is that some of you will get excited and say, yeah, this is how fishes really live. Try one aquarium where you actually embrace that. What's wrong with tearing out some soil from the local creek and dumping it in your aquarium, setting up leaf litter and so forth? Could there be parasites in there? There might be. You have to be a little careful. You have to use some common sense, but you can create an interesting aquarium by just utilizing natural materials, not number 3 aquarium gravel and the plants. Lots of other stuff out there. Again, another flooded forest. I keep coming back to this because it's such an interesting environment. Many of the trees in flooded forests are actually adapted to survive submerged for some period of time. While the wet season is going on, usually it's several months. There's actually tree sponges which grow on these, which is really interesting because that's a whole genera of organisms that we never play with in freshwater. Sponges that live in freshwater on trees that are submerged seasonally. And then when the waters recede, they go into sort of a hard case and sort of go into dormant mode. But there's an entire cycle of life that we don't really play with much, and we should, and we'll talk about that in a little bit. Even puddles. It was really fun visiting Jack this afternoon to see the killifish setups that he has, and I kept thinking about how killies live and how they're intimately tied to their environment, perhaps more than just about any type of fish that we know. They're dependent on these seasonal cycles of wet and dry. The eggs are adapted to various types of substrates where they actually need them for their development. And I keep thinking about managing an aquarium naturally. Now this would be a little more work for a breeder. This is probably not an attractive way to go, but for a casual hobbyist that wants to keep some fish in an unusual manner, wouldn't it be interesting to set up an aquarium like this with leaf litter and substrate, put your fish in there, slowly lower the water level over a period of months, take the fishes out, let the substrate sit for the required incubation period of time, and gradually wet it again? It's the same thing we've been doing for generations, but it's just done in an aquarium instead of in a bag of or a container of peat moss. So if you think about it differently, there's lots of cool things you can do with botanical materials. That's a blank slide. And this is another of my favorite habitats. So a friend of mine took this for me when he was down in the Pantanal region. It looks like a pile of muck, but what this is papyrus. And what happens in the papyrus when the waters return to this particular area called Campo Grande in Brazil, the material starts decomposing over time and creates this incredible matrix. He said it was about 1 meter, 3 feet thick of just muck. And he said there were literally thousands of characins in there, and tons of different types of tetras that live in this habitat, reproduce in this habitat seasonally, and they feed, they live out their lives in this habitat. And when the waters recede, they either head off to more permanent water, or they die in those ponds. But it's an incredibly diverse environment. And can we replicate this in the aquarium? We could. Does it require maybe some different procedure than what we've done before? Probably. Is it sustainable? I think it is. I think by actively managing an aquarium, we can replicate these types of interesting habitats, things that we've never really played with before. That's the, okay, there we go. This is another example from South America. Palm fronds, pond materials, sort of sitting there on the surface, and you can see the substrate is what I really want you to look at. The substrate is a lot of leaves and a lot of palm fronds and a lot of decomposing leaf litter over essentially soil. Again, something that we can do in an aquarium, something that we haven't probably played with a lot because it's just something that we don't think about when you can easily open a bag of sand and use that. Why not play with some of these more authentic substrates? What benefits can we gain from them? What benefits will they bring our fishes? Why would we do this? Because it's a neat way to learn about how our fishes really live. When you want to talk about a natural aquarium, that would be a natural aquarium. Again, the Pantanal, once again, this is a flooded meadow. You can see this is terrestrial grass called paspalum, which is a common species known in North America, South America. There's a lot of different species, one called Bahia grass or Bermuda grass. It's a relative of that. These are not aquatic plants. This has all the elements that I want in an aquarium. Leaf litter, terrestrial grasses. Who's to say, again, we'll talk about that in a little bit, you could plant some terrestrial grass seeds in a substrate, grow them out, and then flood the tank over time, replicating this habitat. So there's lots of things you can do. Again, the interaction between land and water. This is from South America. Another one of those things that I find so fascinating is trees and bushes where the branches come into the water. Fishes utilize these. Anybody that's ever been to a wild aquatic habitat knows fishes interact with these materials. They hide among them, they feed on them, they reproduce in them. And again, when we try to aquascape or create an aquarium, it's always fun when we think about why we're doing it. It's not just the look, think about the function. What behaviors will you get from, say, your pencilfish or your splash tetras or some of the more unusual fishes when you set up an aquarium to replicate something like this? We see a lot of people setting up aquariums where the wood is coming out of the water, but what about where the wood's going into the water? Think about orientation, think about why this occurs. This occurs because these plants grow along this area that over time, the water will start coming in and flooding, and the trees are in place. They're there for years and years, so they just keep growing in that orientation. But this is another example. This is an area that's during the dry season, same area. Tons of leaf litter. So the forest floor essentially becomes an aquatic habitat over time, but for several months out of the year, it's a forest floor. Again, if you wanted to get really imaginative in an aquarium, if you're into, say, I don't know, aerofogs or other amphibians or reptiles, you can perhaps keep them in there during the dry season, get them out when it's time to flood it, start flooding it gradually, add the fishes. So you get to enjoy the best of both worlds. So it's sort of an actively managed system. This is what is known as an igarape or canoe way in the local language of South America, the Tupi Indians. They literally have a navigable series of tracks in the forest that during the wet season flood, and they're covered in leaf litter. There's tons of fishes that live in them. The water is very shallow. In most cases, only a foot or two deep. Sometimes it's a little deeper, and they just push their canoes through there. But what an interesting habitat. Again, totally dependent upon land and water interacting together. So it's an example of that dynamic relationship we talk about again and again that I think we should put more thought into as aquarists and do things like this in our aquariums. This is Southeast Asia. Similar scenario where you see area that floods out during the wet season, but there's terrestrial vegetation growing around it. Lots of fishes. In this case, there would be Rasbora and other fishes like that. Again, another close-up because I like to show substrate. Here you can see a little cichlid in the middle. And again, just detritus-covered leaf litter and substrate. That's a natural substrate, not sand and gravel. And some of the best botanical aquariums that I see encourage the accumulation of some of this fungal growth, some of this detritus, and just a matrix of natural materials, algae and so forth. So again, to rethink the word natural is really important. This, my friend Mike Tucanardi took this one in Brazil. This is the habitat of the tailed pencilfish when he was collecting them there. What's interesting about this is a matrix of of tree roots and material that comes off the trees, and it's also accumulates leaf litter. What's neat about this particular locale and a bunch of other ones in South America that I saw, some of these are in existence for decades. They're known navigation hazards or known features in the topography of the local people. These are like coral reefs. They're there for many, many years. They have generations of fishes growing in them. And there's all kinds of fishes living in these. Everything from rivulus, killifish, to cichlids, to small characins, to knife fishes. Who has ever thought of replicating something like that in an aquarium? Floating leaf litter mats. There's actually I found an actual scientific paper on the ecodiversity of a floating leaf litter mat. If somebody wants the reference, I can email it to you. It's a fascinating read where this guy broke down the study of all the fishes. There's like 30 or 40 different species of many of which are known to aquariums living in like a leaf litter mat like that. So again, an interesting habitat that's seldom replicated. And again, there's that interplay between land and water. This is you'll see this just about anywhere there's a stream or whatever, but what I find fascinating is, this is nice, I find this area really interesting. The soil, the roots, the root map, the plants, all that stuff that accumulates in that area. It would be fun to model an aquarium based on that, because there's such an amazing interplay of two habitats right in that area. So something that we should, again, think about. If you get nothing else out of this idea, you can think that I'm into a lot of geeky things like dirt. So another one of my absolute favorite habitats is called a mangle. This is where mangroves grow. And mangrove environments are intertidal. They're usually brackish, sometimes fully marine, and occasionally fresh, and sometimes even black water. But this is an intertidal brackish water mangrove habitat. This is low tide. You can see the huge matrix of still roots that accumulate on the bottom. Again, detritus and sand and so forth accumulating. This is what they call the nursery of the reefs. This is where a lot of fishes come off the tropical reefs to go reproduce, to juveniles grow there and grow up in these little matrices of roots. There's a lot going on there. Another classic photo of an Agapo. I don't even need to really describe it much more, but you see the same recipe over and over again. Leaf litter, twigs, terrestrial plants, slightly turbid water. This is completely normal, a diverse, ecologically vibrant habitat that's never replicated in a virtual manner. Aquariums can absolutely reflect this. This is an aquarium that I created a couple years back to replicate. I found you ever do this? You ever go on like Google and you try to find the ecological description of a fish you're into? Well, I found the one, the Tucano, the Tucano tetra. For some reason I decided I wanted to get into that fish. And so I found the actual original description by Jacques Guéry, the very famous ichthyologist and a bunch of other associates, where they described this fish. And they described it as a tangle of ficus roots and leaf litter in about 2 meters of water. And it's only found in one little, the type locality is this one little stream in Brazil. And I thought, wow, that's right for replicating, because usually we see fishes like the Tucano tetra in a planted aquarium, a nature aquarium. And I thought, well, let's give them a real natural aquarium. And again, you can do these. This is probably the easiest tank I've ever created. And I think it's one of my favorites. Yes?
How big is that aquarium?
This is a small aquarium. This is a Ultimate Nature Systems 45U, it's called. It's about 8 gallons. It's about 45 centimeters long. It's a tiny tank. Yeah, little guy. It could be done on a bigger scale. In fact, I was going to do that, but have you priced Tucano tetras lately? It's a lot. But yeah, so you can do, that's the nice thing about small tanks, just my little pitch. I never liked little tanks until I really started playing with some of these geeky experiments, because it gives you the ability to do these things and get in and out of them quickly with minimal expense. But yeah, you can do really realistic representations of these habitats with minimal risk by doing them on a small scale and then scaling them up. Again, oops, I went backwards. Okay, another brackish aquarium we did, just again because the mangle is so interesting. Just a matrix of live mangroves with mangrove rootwood. I have a friend that lives in Honolulu, and in Honolulu the red mangrove is invasive, and the city will literally pay you to cut them down. So they go out on Saturdays and cut these mangroves down, which to us as an aquarist would be a tragedy, but to them it's saving their ecosystem. they don't care what you do with the wood, so he sent me a whole bunch of it. So I took these branches and tried to simulate that the best I could. But the idea was not to have a crystal clear aquarium. The idea was to allow an accumulation of leaf litter when it falls off the tree in bark materials. That's a brackish water aquarium, specific gravity 1.015. Little, not crystal clear water. Those are orange chromite cichlids, wild ones that I got from an actual brackish water habitat, which I thought was really cool. But the point of this is not to say this is a great looking tank, it's to say that it's a functionally aesthetic tank. It looks cool, but it also functions a lot like the habitat that it represents, which is what I'd love to see more of us doing as opposed to just a diorama of a habitat. So another one, which again, one of my other favorite materials to work with is palm fronds, because palm fronds are commonly found in these aquatic habitats. They fall off into the water. With the usual suspects, leaf litter and so forth. This is representing the habitat of the cardinal tetra. And again, if you research the cardinal tetra and the green neon tetra, that's Paracherodon simulans, they're actually found together or nearby. They're in different environments and they like different temperature requirements, but they're very closely related. So interesting to see you can do an interesting tank based on that. This is another aquarium based on that same idea of water and land, allowing detritus, fungal growth, and turbidity. Those are things that we shouldn't be afraid of. Not every habitat is crystal clear. Again, these tanks can function indefinitely. This is a tank that's been set up for over a year. This is another version of that. Remember I was showing you that sort of shoreline? This is the same thing that a friend of mine did over in Europe and kind of replicated that shoreline. And that's black water, it's a lot of mud, it's a lot of substrate material, very sustainable display. Another example, which I think is beautiful too. Notice these are bars. Notice that again, the water's slightly turbid, a tangle of leaf litter and decomposing material. People ask me, how do you filter these aquariums? This is the filter. Think about that too, put your head around that. The tank is the filter. The ecology that you foster in the aquarium. The organisms that live in the substrate, live on the plants, live on that matrix of root, that's providing your filtration. Yes, you can have a filter and have some water movement, but that's your biological filter.
Well, with all that
Decomposing stuff.
yeah.
All that stuff.
With all that stuff decomposing and stuff, wouldn't it lower the oxygen level in the water so you would have to lightly stock these tanks?
It could, if you overstock a tank, if you have too many fishes in the tank, too many active fishes, that could be a problem. You probably want to have some supplemental aeration. And I'm not saying to set up an aquarium with no filter, but my point was that the actual filtration, when you think about it, we try to build a biological filter, right, with bacteria and so forth, in a box or a filter compartment or whatever. Well, the bacteria is living in all this material. So if you're just providing current circulation, the tank is doing the filtration. Sure, you could have a filter if you don't maybe like the water being necessarily turbid. You can clear that up. And you want to break the water line with a little oxygen to, the boundary layer gets a gas exchange. Sure. But a lot of fishes do just fine in this habitat. So it's a good question, and it's something that's important to kind of get our heads around, because it is easy to just say, oh, dump a whole bunch of stuff in the water and I got this great tank. Well, yeah, you can kill your fishes, and you have to think about it. And you don't want to take an established aquarium and dump a whole lot of material in, because you add a whole lot of anything to an established aquarium, that's a recipe for disaster. So good question.
Would you have to make a slow transition?
Very slow.
Yeah, because you've got the ammonia levels.
Well, interestingly, I've never have done this, and I've deliberately overdone it, because if you're going to talk about it, you got to do it. And I've never been able to kill a tank by doing that, except the way to do it is to dump a ton of material into it, where it's a disproportionately large amount of stuff all at once. But for the most part, if you go gradually, you can easily transition an aquarium from your more conventional type of aquarium to something a little different like this. This is an example of an aquarium set up not too long ago, but you can see the turbidity, that the water's not crystal clear because you have stuff decomposing. I like to use a lot of materials like clays and so forth to replicate the natural podzolic soil that's found in South America. And it's very acidic. It doesn't grow plants well, but it grows aquatic plants, interestingly enough. But it has a lot of material which leaches into the water, so you'll get that turbidity, which, as you saw from the million photos I bored you with, the water's not crystal clear in a lot of these habitats, and it's not because it's dirty, it's because of the material. Yeah.
Do they stink?
No, that's a great question, and no, they don't. And that's what's interesting. You would think that if you're adding all this stuff to the water, there'd be like hydrogen sulfide or something. When you think about hydrogen sulfide, I'm not a chemist, and I'm probably not good at describing it, but it usually things go anaerobic in the total absence of oxygen. Well, I don't think our substrates, oops, this just cut out on me. The battery probably died.
I don't know.
Did the battery die? Am I not?
Who knows? It's an Apple product.
I can just talk. Is this okay? Or do you want that in mind?
We can try to wave more batteries. I don't know who's in charge of the battery spot.
Yeah.
Use their second.
Yeah, I think the battery died. Okay, well, anyway, it's so in the absence of oxygen, yes, but for the most part, they don't stink. We're gonna use the other. This one cuts out sometimes, I think, but.
It's directional, so you have to talk right into it.
This one?
If you turn your head, it.
Okay, so I'm gonna stay in one point, okay. So, yeah, so then it's definitely possible to create those habitats, but surprisingly, no. That's what's I was looking at Melanie's tanks today. There was as much leaf litter as just about any other aquarium I'd ever seen. And, I'm sorry. And they absolutely, you don't have any issues with that. The tanks don't smell. My tanks don't smell. Most people don't have an issue with that. So it's a very good question, though, because you would think that would be the case, but generally not. And we'll talk about maintenance, but it's just common sense maintenance. This is another tank, one of my favorite aquariums that I did recently. Probably the most simple, if you want to use the word botanical method aquarium, it's just leaf litter, a very thin layer of the substrate I was talking about, and oak branches, and that's it. And the stuff starts breaking down, the water gets very dark, you'll get the biofilm on the wood, but not a smell. Yeah.
You don't worry about taking that.
The bark? I don't with that, I haven't. I mean, probably good best practice for a lot of people with a lot of wood they use in aquascaping is to take the bark off, but when you think about it, why do people take the bark off? It's because they don't want all the tannins and lignin and all that stuff. Well, we value it. So it's the opposite. Everything that you learn not to do, I would say go ahead and do. Terrible. Listen, I'm sorry.
You want like a minimum water flow and stuff?
Yeah, yeah. When you just put your leaves in, you mean? Yeah, probably what you want to do is direct the returns towards the surface to let the leaves stay down. Some leaves, if you boil leaves, which is what I like to do, or steep them, they'll saturate. It takes a little while, but once they're down, they're going to stay down. And you have to be a little flexible. That leads me to another, kind of a good question, because a lot of people say, well, I want to do a scape. Well, again, don't think about it as an aquascape. Think about it as sort of recreating a aquatic habitat, and those leaves are going to get redistributed, just like they do in nature, by current, by fishes' activities, by just general movement when you go in there and maintain them. So a tank today, the tank looks completely different, 3 weeks from now, because stuff redistributes, stuff breaks down. These aren't static habitats in a way, they're dynamic. You can replenish the leaf litter, you can let it break down completely, which I do. Some people like to take it out the minute it starts breaking down because they don't like the look of it, but it's a very dynamic habitat. You can manage it in a lot of different ways. When we were talking earlier about these agapo habitats, I thought how fun it would be to do this at home. And so I called it the Urban Agapo, and I couldn't think of a better name for it. I love to come up with names for stuff for some weird reason. So basically, what I did is I got some grass seed. Oops, I didn't do that. It's called Bahia grass. It's the Pasparum notatum, I believe it's called. It's commonly available. You can find it online. And I planted these seeds in this kind of rich substrate that I created. Sprouted the grass, and then after a few months, I started flooding it. And in this case, this was home to some killifish, but we talked about them today, Jack. What are they? They're Notholibius, I believe. Some fish you're not supposed to have apparently, but South American annual killifish, which would come from this type of habitat. They did their thing, laid their eggs. I desiccated the environment for several months, flooded it again, and lo and behold, I actually got some fry in this thing. So it wasn't designed to be a serious breeding experiment, but it was designed to manage this type of a habitat. This had no filter, by the way. This was managed with small water exchanges. So you can do these kind of interesting things and these interesting experiments on a small scale. This is another example of one of those tanks that I did where you kind of mimic the forest floor and leaf litter, bits and pieces of bark and so forth, and it can be flooded. And this is an example. Used acaros and bamboo. Not particularly creative in terms of what I used, but because that wasn't the point, but the idea was to manage an aquatic ecosystem like this, and it's absolutely possible to do that. This is sort of another representation of a late season agapo. In other words, where it's been flooded a long time, most of the plant material is no longer green and crisp, it's denuded, so I used some little roots that I found from some cypress plants, put those in there, let the biofilms accumulate. Got a really interesting aquarium out of it. Let's talk about blackwater for a second. I mean, the term blackwater in botanical is sort of synonymous, I guess a lot of people say it. The point is, in the aquarium hobby and in ecology, there's two different things. Aquarists will call blackwater any water that has a tint. An ecologist will say it has a very specific set of chemical characteristics, which we won't get into here, but I think it's kind of the importance of researching what we talk about. We should be familiar with blackwater. It's an interesting dynamic habitat. If you're willing to go the extra mile to manipulate water chemistry, you can do some really cool things with it. But for a lot of aquarists, just having the tinted water is good enough. But I think we need to be a little more responsible and not call every tank that has tinted water a blackwater aquarium. We don't want to dumb it down. We want to encourage everybody to experiment and learn more. But it is fascinating. Here's a close-up of that Tucano tetra tank. This was blackwater conditions. I went through a little extra mile of playing around with the water chemistry, and it was fun to do, but it's a little bit of work. Again, similar thing I did for common fishes, neon tetras. This was sort of trying to be a representation of a real tapajos. The water is a little dark for that, but the lemon tetra, which is found in that region, looks really great in blackwater. A lot of fishes in this tinted blackwater environment bring out really amazing colors. This is from that little agapo. This is the acarus, and there's one of the little Achilles that was feeding off the surface at the time. This is just another version of a long established. People ask me, how long can you keep these tanks going? Indefinitely. This is a case where a friend of mine in Hong Kong did this aquarium, and he doesn't like to add new leaves. He likes to keep the original stuff in there till it completely breaks down to nothing. And he has an amazing little tank. He's done a lot of breeding with his Episcograma, which I know that's not an achievement for a lot of people, but it's kind of fun to see them in this type of a habitat. This is another one of those sort of combination where it's the fusion of function and aesthetics. This is a friend of mine that did his version of it at Tapajos. For some reason, he likes the Tapajos, which is an interesting river. It's not truly a blackwater river, but we like to take artistic liberties. But he mimicked the population in that area. Again, a matrix of leaf litter. He actually cheated and put little rocks. In a lot of these blackwater environments, you won't find rocks in a lot of these places because the geology of the soil, which is the main driver of blackwater, is not conducive to rock formation. They're usually redistributed from somewhere down, up in the mountains or whatever, but generally you don't find a true blackwater environment with a lot of rock. Again, you want to go purely artistic and creative. Here's the representation. It's an aesthetic representation. I wouldn't call this a botanical style aquarium or botanical method aquarium, with the exception that it uses leaf litter in the filter to kind of provide the visual tint to the water, but it's that look. So you can play aesthetic. There's another shot of a different mangrove tank that we did. This is early on before the mangroves really started growing out. And it was fun to do blackwater with mangroves. And there are alternative means to tinting the water. I don't mean to put a product shot in there, but that's just a product that we have. But people use blackwater extracts, people use leaves, they use rooibos tea. You ever heard of rooibos tea? It tastes pretty good too, but apparently I guess a lot of angelfish people swear by it. It's an African or South African tea that apparently does a nice job tinting the water. I've never used the stuff. I hear it's lightly caffeinated, so maybe it stimulates your fishes. I don't know. No, it's decaffeinated. Okay, it's decaffeinated. Then it stimulates your fishes in other ways, but yes. So you can do other things. And the most important question I get all the time, like, can you do a planted blackwater aquarium? Absolutely, 100%. Plants are found in blackwater habitats. The main factor in inhibiting plant growth in blackwater aquariums, you want to know what it is? Light penetration. That's it. That's all it is. But for some reason, the myth got perpetuated online that you can't have tinted water in plants. You absolutely can. Crank the light up. It's simple as that. If you've got a rich substrate, meet all the other requirements for plant growth, there's no reason why you can't have a blackwater aquarium with plants. I've seen and done a few tanks myself, but friends that are much more talented than me with tanks have beautiful blackwater planted aquariums like this one. Now I wanted to sort of demonstrate the easiest version of a blackwater planted aquarium. This is a tank that you saw before, where it was just roots and, branches and leaf litter. And then I thought, okay, what would be a good plant to grow in this? And I decided on the narrow leaf java. Yeah, and this is what I did, and it grew like mad in this tank, and this was the easiest planted black tinted water aquarium I've ever done. And have my summer wormies in there. It's a great little thing. Substrate, I'll just touch on this briefly. Substrate is super important. And it's something that I think as aquarium hobbyists in general we haven't thought about. As planted aquarium people, you've probably given a lot of thought to because you're trying to grow plants, you want a nutritive substrate. But what about the benefits of the substrate for the fishes? What are the benefits? I'm not 100% certain, but I know one thing that they can do is that the substrate can influence the water chemistry. And it can also encourage the growth of microorganisms, right? Because by virtue of its structure and what it's comprised of, bits and pieces of soil and plants and so forth, you can actually encourage microbial life to grow. You can use it as a component of your aquarium as opposed to just an afterthought or just a purely aesthetic component. Substrate's really important. In a lot of these habitats, one of the drivers of the ecology is substrate, because that's where the terrestrial or aquatic plants grow, that's where the leaf litter decomposes and so forth. Substrates can be more than sand. Substrates can be crushed up twigs, they can be bits of bark, they can be leaf litter, they can be root sections, just like in nature. Again, another agapo habitat, probably a little more turbid than most of us would want, but this is an example of what's a few inches below the water. It's very turbid. This is an example of a tank I did where I just used little bits of oak twigs to form the substrate. I cheated a little bit because I'm a fish person and I had a little bit of sand on the bottom, but I wanted to at least explore that. You can do it without the sand, I just thought it looked a little better. Let's just talk about the process real quick. I know how am I on time? Is people falling asleep? Do I need to move along? Okay, we're good. Okay, so let's talk about preparation. We'll go back. So preparation. So what do you do when you get this? You have leaves that you either purchase or you've collected. Two things. If you're sure you collected them from an area that's free of pollution, you can give them a light rinse, maybe a steep in some boiling water for a few minutes. Why do we boil? Well, we boil for two reasons. We boil, number one, to kill any potential pathogens. We boil to break down the cutinous layer on some of these leaves and some of these seed pods so it takes on water and starts sinking. It'll release some of the materials contained inside of it. Mostly it's like lignin, maybe some tannins. In the case of materials which aren't fully dried, that's the important thing. Like leaves, you wouldn't want to collect them onto the tree because they have their store of sugars and polysaccharides and all that stuff that you don't necessarily want in your aquarium, right? It's pollutants. So you want to collect naturally fallen, dried material, or you can collect them off the tree and dry them yourself. One of my favorite leaves to play with is oak, because it's abundant. You can collect it yourself. It's generally clean. You can collect it with the matrix of the material that comes with it, bits of bark and even some soil and so forth. Makes a fantastic leaf litter substrate. I like to boil it because again, it'll sink, and I don't have any illusions that it's necessary because it actually isn't. If it comes from a clean enough area and you're willing to take your time and go slowly, you can use all kinds of things from nature. But it's important to, I think, at least think about preparing materials because we don't want to get in the habit of just dumping any old thing into our aquariums. That's irresponsible. So we need to do some research. And guess what? The reality is when you're using things you might collect, you might kill some fishes because maybe it is toxic. We don't know. So we have to be adventurous if we're going to do this. So there's a certain amount of responsibility, that we have to take on if we're going to collect our own stuff from the wild. So if you're buying things that you're used to seeing, that you've read about in hobby magazines that people use, that's one thing. But when you're trying just that leaf that you found in the backyard, there's a certain amount of risk. So again, can you collect your own stuff? Absolutely. I encourage you to go collect oak. I encourage you to collect different branches, twigs. You have a local creek where there's stuff accumulating. I would try it. If there's fish in there, chances are it's pretty safe. You might want to clean it because you don't want to, if you're worried about parasites, which, and we've had this discussion before, it's like how much parasitic load is there in a handful of leaves? I don't know. But again, it's about responsibility and experimentation. So for those of you that are willing to do a little experiment to go beyond the ordinary, there's all kinds of things you can do with yourself. You don't have to incur the expense of buying leaves from some crazy guy in LA. Again, the preparation consists of rinsing, soaking, and boiling. Why do we soak? It seems like it's so redundant. People say, Scott, if you're boiling a leaf because you want all this tannin, and then you're telling me to dump the water out because we don't want to use that water, aren't you getting rid of a lot of the tannin? So number one, you're not getting rid of a lot of the tannin because that stuff's going to, these will continue to leach out of many of these leaves for as long as they're submerged. There's a lot more in there than you think. And number two, why don't I use the water that I boil the botanicals in? Because think about why you're boiling it initially. Number one, you're boiling it to break down that layer of to permeate the layer, let the leaves saturate. You're also doing it to release some of the pollutants that may be bound up in the surface tissues of the leaves and the seed pods. Do you really want to add a concentrate of that stuff to your tank? So that's my case for not doing the homemade black water extract, because I'm convinced that although it's probably harmless, I'm convinced that it's probably not the best thing to add a concentrate of pollutants to your aquarium. So we have to create some sort of best practices, I think. So again, this is my summary of why would we do this. Remove the pollutants, release that initial burst of tannins, and saturate and sink them. Yeah.
What do you feel about black water, pecan, or some other book we have here?
You know what? I know some people that have used those, and they haven't had any issues. But I think it's a go for it. I always hate to say expendable fishes, but I mean maybe snails. Maybe something that pest snails that you don't like. See how they do. I think it's important to realize that fishes could be lost. I have to be honest with you though. In playing with these most of my adult life, I have not lost a fish because of a poisonous material that I've used. I've lost fish from being stupid and adding 5 pounds of leaf litter to a 2-gallon tank, that kind of thing. But generally I've not had any issues. And that's not saying to be reckless or crazy or that absolutely you should do this, but I encourage that kind of experimentation. That's just another little infographic I did, and I can send that to you if you need it. But it's basically what we tell people to do. Boil or steam. 60 minutes is like the golden rule for boiling. Let it cool, put it in some new fresh water, rinse it, then place them gradually in your tank over time. And that's as simple as that. That's how we do it. Okay, let's talk about expectations and fundamentals in the aquariums. Now, one of the things that you're going to see in a botanical method aquarium is decomposition. The stuff's going to start to break down. The minute you put terrestrial material in an aquatic environment, it recruits all this stuff and it begins to break down. So it's really important to understand that you're going to see decomposing leaves. A lot of people don't like that look. They find that very, very, unsettling. I find it very, very natural. And again, looking at hundreds of pictures of these aquatic ecosystems in the wild, that's what you see on the bottom, is decomposing material. Again, an aquarium, I have no illusions, an aquarium is not an open ecosystem with millions of gallons of throughput every day. But the same principles or the same the same rules that apply to a natural ecosystem apply to a closed ecosystem. So it is possible to understand this and get our heads around it and accept decomposing material. Biofilms, that's going to happen. That we see that every time we cure a piece of wood. Bacterial biofilms are abundant, they're everywhere, they're ubiquitous in nature, and they're highly beneficial for our fishes and for other animals. They're not something to be feared. And I think, again, it's most of what I talk about so much is mental shifts, getting ourselves out of the head space of an aquarium has to be this crystal clear, perfect environment. You guys are an advanced group. That's not something that you guys will say, but it's something that the aquascaping crowd will say when they use the word natural. They can't get their heads around the fact that you're letting this stuff accumulate in a tank, because to them an aquarium is supposed to be crystal clear, perfect. Everything's got to be sterile. And I just believe that there's a better way to keep aquariums. That's my sort of idea here. Again, biofilms, fishes will eat them. These are some of my snakeskin barbs munching on biofilms. That's what they do. They spend a lot of time. And that's the other thing I've noticed with botanical method aquariums. When you go out of town and you're not able to feed, or you don't have somebody that's able to feed them, the fish are sustaining themselves on what's in the tank. Now, I did a kind of a geeky experiment a few years ago with big green neon touch up there, Caradon simulons. I set up an aquarium with leaf litter only and some twigs, and I said, can I sustain these fishes on just this stuff? So I stopped feeding after the first few weeks. After they were quarantined and acclimated, no more food went in that tank. I maintained that aquarium for 14 months with no food. I did water exchanges, the usual aquarium stuff. I wasn't trying to do avoid that, but I didn't want to feed them. I just wanted to see if I could sustain them on what's produced in the tank. Not only were they fat and happy the whole time, I had 2 spawning events. So I must have been doing something right. I think these tanks can actually produce a lot of supplementary, or in this case, primary food for certain fishes. Now, you can't keep your big cichlids in this type of a tank, but your geophagus might enjoy sifting through some leaf litter. And we've talked about this before. What better environment to raise fry than an environment of decomposing leaves where there's natural fungal growth, biofilms, and the organisms that live in there. So just another approach to it, not as easily controlled as a sterile breeding tank where you're pumping brine shrimp in, but it's another way to go about it. So food production of a food web, which is something I encourage you to research, is really interesting. So again, my big idea, my big overarching idea is the aquarium is actually a filter, right? And that's true for most aquariums. When you think about it, the aquarium, the life forms in the aquarium become the filter. It's the same in a reef aquarium. When you think about it, what is a coral? A coral is designed to, it's a diffusion gradient. A coral takes in water. It feeds on the water. It's a filtration mechanism, essentially. This is what an aquarium is. An aquarium is basically a big organism. When we think about it holistically, that's something that's really important. We don't have to necessarily be dependent on all kinds of technical props. I'm not saying not to use filters. I'm a big fan of filters, but I'm saying, think about, we talk about biological filtration. Where is most of the biological filtration taking place? It's taking place in the material you have in the aquarium. So, it's just another way to look at things. Then we get to detritus. Now, detritus gets a bad rap from everybody. Oh, it's bad stuff. But think about what detritus is. I mean, the definition is horrible. Dead particulate organic matter typically leaves the bodies of fragments of dead organisms, which is not something you want, as well as fecal material, yuck. Detritus is typically colonized by communities of microorganisms which act to decompose or remineralize this material. So, you see that part about it, it's colonized by communities of microorganisms. It's food. It's somebody's food. So, what do we want? We want some of these microorganisms in our aquariums, right? We depend on them for filtration. So think about this. If we're so meticulous that we siphon out every bit of detritus in our tank, we're depriving these organisms of their food and thus interrupting a food web. What happens when you take away somebody's food? They starve. And if you're thinking about these organisms as a benefit, you're actually depriving them of the very benefit that they need to provide you with the benefit. So I think we have to be a little more kind to detritus and not be immediately get this stuff out of the tank. I agree, it's not the most attractive thing to everybody, but there's really nothing wrong with a little bit of detritus in your tank. If your overall husbandry is good, and this is a group that doesn't need to be told to pick up a siphon hose, you're not going to kill your tank by having detritus. The biggest problem, again, is making that mental shift to say that it doesn't look so bad to have a little detritus in there. So think about that. And then, without getting too scientific and artsy-fartsy here, pH reduction in botanicals. The one myth I want to blow up above everything else is that you generally can't just throw in leaf litter into your tap water and expect the pH to plummet and get soft water. The botanicals will not soften water. They don't perform ion exchange, with the exception of peat moss. There's a little bit of stuff on that, but they'll reduce your pH slightly depending on the alkalinity or the hardness of the water, carbonate hardness, but in typical tap water, they're not going to do much. But just because water is dark, just because it has a certain look, doesn't mean it's soft and acidic. Because you could have, like my Brackish water aquarium I showed you with a pH of 8.5 was as tinted as any black water aquarium I've ever seen. But it wasn't a black water aquarium. So that's a myth that I think has been perpetuated because it's made kind of visuals for so many things, and people make that assumption that if it's dark, it's low pH, and that just isn't. So let's not fall into that trap. And then again, this is my plea, since I've now taken up a lot of your time. Follow me on Instagram, follow my company, Tannin Aquatics. We also have a podcast that I do if you want to hear me pontificate on things you probably don't even want to hear about. I will talk about all these geeky things. It's called The Tint. And sometimes we have really fun guests and talk about some interesting things. And it's everything I know and have learned, and the community of people claim that this stuff is learned. So I really encourage you to check it out. It's called The Tint. It's a lot of fun. We have a lot of interesting people on it, and we're always open to new ideas. And the one thing I wanted to tell you also is that you should not be afraid to experiment. The thing I love about this group is it's a mixed group of pretty advanced hobbyists, and you guys are the key people to play around with some of these ideas, because bringing your experience to new areas is really exciting, and the whole hobby can progress from this. So it's a lot of fun.
Where's your podcast?
My podcast is on pretty much every podcast, capturing on like Apple Podcasts and Spotify, et cetera, et cetera. So thank you so much. Does anybody have any questions, comments, threats? Anything? Any questions? Yes.
What do you use for substrate when you start out?
Good question. It depends. In most of my aquariums, I use like a silica sand, just a very inert, like the pool kind of sand, the pool filter sand. I like silica because it has no real impact on the alkalinity or hardness. I made some of my own substrate mixes where I use clays and so forth and play with that. I've been using that more and more. And again, we talked about alternative substrate materials. You could just do a substrate of leaves or twigs or broken down mold, as we call it. So you can feel free to create, but I think silica is a good starting point. Yeah. Any other questions? Yes.
If you look, like I know where there's like a cypress ponds and stuff like that. Can you just like hot start one, just like by dredging out some stuff there?
I think that would be an interesting experiment. Melanie, you were telling me you go collect stuff from your local creek, right? Have you started a tank that way, or yeah? So absolutely, yeah. So yeah, I would encourage experimenting with that. Any other questions?
Before I found your site, that's what I
Right, you
had.
found-
I mean,
You're looking up at-
there's no other way.
He's the only dork in the world that plays with
I
this
know,
stuff.
that's all I had.
If you wanted live plants, you spoke about raising the lighting, but is it, since it's basically all dead, is like having light on it, make it like get more moldy or more?
Oh, not necessarily. You might get more algae. Like if you really, I played with that. I know what you're saying. With all this organic material, it's not going to change I don't think the composition of the material, but you might have more algae growing along the surfaces of this because they're benefiting from local nutrients. But there's a point where you can really get the lighting high and really get a lot of algae, but it's way more light than you want to throw at a tank anyway to have an algae problem.
But here's the thing, you're not gonna have these highlight plants to begin with. You're gonna
Right.
have like things like like plants that don't need that much light, so it's a perfect setup.
Right, but having light is for the viewing, you know.
I use
Just-
regular light, you know.
Yeah, just a little aesthetic light.
And then I do have some plants, and I don't have any, and I run 8 and
Yeah, that's a good question too. It's like, for lighting, what do you use to light these tanks? And it's any light format you like, LED, fluorescent, incandescent, desk lamp, whatever, because the main purpose of the lighting in one of these, non-planted tanks is just aesthetics. So it gives you a lot of opportunity to use different things. But if you're lighting it for plants, obviously use your favorite lighting format. Anything else?
We're going to start off with, say, a yellow tank, like a handful of wood.
I would, if you're going to start, a new tank with nothing in it, is that what you're saying? Like a brand new tank?
Established tank, or
Oh, an established tank.
you want to put some,
Yeah, I'd go real slowly. I would like a handful of leaf litter and judge the impact of the fishes. Do water tests. Do you see ammonia? Do you see any issues? Do you see phosphates? Typically, I haven't seen any issues, water chemistry wise with any of my botanical aquariums over time. They're on most hobby test kits, undetectable nitrate, which is counterintuitive. You'd think there'd be a lot of organics, almost undetectable phosphates. So, but as far as adding stuff to an established environment, go slowly because you need the bacteria in the system need to be able to absorb any organics that's put into the water. So you don't want to add a large quantity at once that they can't cope with. So yeah, just go slowly. Any other questions or comments? We'll be here the rest of the night. So thank you very much.
I'll try to hold this directionally. Scott very generously brought a big box of some really cool botanicals from Tannin Aquatics that he is donating to Maasai that Mike Huber, where is he, is going to be auctioning off momentarily. Some really cool stuff in here, and I brought the document camera. We'll see if I'm not standing in the way of my work, so that we can see some of the stuff that's up for auction.
Those are called Dregia. It's actually related